Good day, ladies and gentlemen, dear guests, everybody joining us online. Welcome to today's discussion and of a very important report on reintegrating internally displaced persons in urban settings. My name is Daniel Naujoks. I'm a professor here at Columbia School of International Public Affairs, and it is my privilege to coordinate our Committee on Forced Migration, which is operating under Columbia Global. I briefly give you the run-off show, the program of what we're doing today, and then more important people will take the stage. So we first have a short welcome remark by our esteemed Wafa El-Sadr, who's Executive Vice President Columbia Global, followed by a keynote address by our most important speaker, Paula Gaviria Bentancur, who serves as UN Special Rapporteur on the human rights of internally displaced people. Then we have a short video message from an IDP from Ukraine, after which we have a panel discussion with very distinguished panelists. Following that, we will attempt to have a meaningful Q&A session, but I also want to caution us, we do have quite a big program for this short period of time, so let's see how much we can get, but I would love to give the floor to some of you here. So without further ado, it is my privilege to welcome our Executive Vice President of Columbia Global, Wafa El-Sadr.
Well, thank you very much, Daniel, and it's great to see you all here for this very, very important session. So again, welcome. And before I say a few words about Columbia Global and about the Committee on Forced Migration, I just want to acknowledge Daniel and who's leading this committee and for his amazing leadership and commitment to these issues here at Columbia and beyond. So let me tell you a little bit about Columbia Global very briefly, because I know we're short on time, but I think it would be helpful for you to appreciate what we do and how we do it. So Columbia Global was established as a new initiative here at Columbia in 2022. And the purpose was to serve as a bridge, essentially, to how can we serve as a bridge between the university and the rest of the world. And by that, I mean both local and global. So I think it was also just to reflect, this was the idea of Columbia Global really emanated from a very important conviction that we have, that the big challenges of today, which include, of course, displacement, migration, and many others, need to be met by both rigorous thinkers and scholarship, as well as by directed action. So our goal is to create the opportunities for faculty, for students, for our researchers and others to learn, to exchange information, to test their ideas with practitioners, which is very important, as well as with academics and policymakers around the globe. So it is our aspiration, which is best really captured by our tagline. And our tagline, which you see in the corner here, is where thinking meets doing. So let me now describe a bit about the Committee on Forced Migration, and it very much is at home in Columbia Global, based on what I just described to you, bridging the scholarship with the action. And it was created at a time in response to the alarming, of course, rise in number of forced migrants and displaced people around the world. And in response to this, when the committee was established, really more than 80 faculty came together from different schools and different backgrounds and disciplines, came together across all of our different campuses, bringing their knowledge and their commitment, their expertise to address the issues at hand. I'm very grateful for the committee and particularly, of course, to Daniel and the faculty members who are involved in this work, that they're creating the space for all of us to come together today, to be aware of what's going on around the world, and to consider, of course, the human dimensions of displacement. And I'm very grateful for Daniel, of course, for his leadership of this work. Now, I don't see him. I think he's disappeared. At this point, I was going to actually ask him to join me, welcome him to take the floor. Thank you very much, Daniel, and thanks to all of you for being here. And please stay tuned for our many events at Columbia Global. Once you come here once, you're going to be on our mailing list. So you'll be very excited about a lot of the events that we host almost on a weekly basis. Thanks again, Daniel.
Thank you, Professor Sadre. And now we turn to the person most of you probably have come here to listen to. We have Paula Gaviria Betancourt, who for the last 3 years has served as Special Rapporteur on the human rights of internally displaced persons, put into position by the Human Rights Council. She is a human rights lawyer and forced displacement expert who's also currently serving as executive director at Compass, a nonprofit organization founded by Nobel laureate and former Colombian president Juan Manuel Santos. For more than 2 decades, she has worked tirelessly on human rights, humanitarian affairs within civil society, to judiciary, academia, and government. Among the many things she has done, she served as president of Colombia's Human Rights Advisor. She was member of the UN Secretary's high-level panel on internal displacement that 3-4 years ago issued an important report on this. And again, in Colombia, she supported the preparation, implementation of the country's victims law and directed the victims unit, very important for IDP issues too. And today, we're going to hear the Special Rapporteur present the key recommendations and issues of a report she just launched. She just presented to the General Assembly. This is the reason she's in New York. And I am very eager to hear what she has to say, and I'm sure you do too. We'll have a Special Rapporteur, and we'll put the presentation on. 1 second.
Yo lo puedo hacer si quieres, trato yo para el otro lado, para el otro lado. Okay. Thanks, Daniel. When you said the person that everyone wanted to hear, I was looking everywhere. I didn't think it was me. But then I said, oh yeah, it's me. But I really came to listen to you. That's what I'm expecting that happens today. So I'm just part of the conversation. Good morning to everyone. It's hi, Michelle. A familiar face. Thank you very much for being here at Columbia University, at Columbia Global. Thank you for hosting the dialogue in such short notice on this important topic of the report that I just presented yesterday to the Third Committee at the General Assembly. And thank you for your remarks. I don't see Dr. El Sadre anymore. She's not here. Okay, so thank her for her remarks, and Daniel, Professor Daniel, and your team. Thank you for your commitment and to making this event happen. It's almost as important as yesterday's presentation at the Third Committee, being here. So thank you so much. And I am so very happy, and it's a pleasure to be accompanied by the representatives of UNHCR, of UN Habitat, UNDP, the International Center for Transitional Justice, OD Global. We're going to hear her from a video, and especially by Tatiana Dumeyeva, an internally displaced woman and a friend from Ukraine who kindly shared her testimony in a pre-recorded video that we're going to listen in a minute. So yesterday, when I presented my report to the Third Committee of the General Assembly, I shared with the member states a sentence that resonated to me during the consultations that we held for this report. One internally displaced mother said to me, we reached the city, but we're still searching for home. And these words served yesterday as a reminder that displacement does not end with physical relocation. It ends only when rights are restored and people can rebuild their lives as equal members of society with safety and with dignity. And it summons also what the report is about and the messages that I tried to send in this report. So today, over 50 million of the world's 83.4 million internally displaced persons live in towns and cities. Urban displacement is a topic of urgent relevance and growing complexity that demands a multidisciplinary response. Cities are paradoxical spaces for internally displaced persons. On one hand, they offer promise, services, jobs, education. But on the other hand, they often present new forms of insecurity, of exploitation, of housing precarity, social exclusion, and systemic invisibility. For displaced individuals, the journey to a city may mark an escape from danger, but not necessarily an arrival at safety. I often say that displaced people carry a suitcase, because they do, and that suitcase contains pain, contains loss, contains fear, but also contains expectations of what they will find, a certain hope, a certain longing for what is to come in the city. Moreover, as more people are displaced to within and between cities, the boundaries between displacement, economic migration, and urban poverty continue to blur. And I'm sure that's a subject of study of this center. Despite these challenges, displaced persons demonstrate extraordinary resilience by rebuilding their lives and contributing meaningfully to the social and economic life of their host communities. The report emphasizes one core truth. Achieving durable solutions in urban settings is not simply a matter of physical relocation, infrastructure, or service delivery. It is a fundamentally human rights-driven process. That's the whole case also of the report. And let me refer to some of the report's elements here today. So one is displacement has long been and is today increasingly urban. Cities often provide improved security and housing options, as I said, more extensive networks of public and private service providers, dynamic economies, diverse labor markets. However, many IDPs move into informal settlements, slums, peri-urban neighborhoods that are often beyond the reach of formal planning and other protections. So internally displaced persons often find themselves navigating overstretched municipal services and discriminatory bureaucracies. And host communities are often wary of newcomers who they see as competitors over scarce resources. Rights that exist on paper often fail to materialize in daily lives of displaced individuals, and risks often increase as urban displacement becomes more protracted. Second, traditional approaches to durable solutions, whether return, resettlement, or local integration, do not sufficiently address the wide range of human rights. Although the framework on durable solutions from the ISC provides a useful starting point for defining and integration, it does not fully capture the subjective elements that may inform individual perceptions as to whether displacement has truly ended. And here's the key. Intangible factors matter. Beyond physical needs, factors such as identity, rootedness, and a sense of belonging determine whether displaced persons feel truly included and able to rebuild their lives. Dignity, trust in themselves and in other institutions, and social cohesion are central to sustainable solutions. This means recognizing psychosocial well-being as integral to recovery. The trauma of displacement reverberates across generations, we all know that, and influences how children learn, how adults rebuild livelihoods, and how communities relate to one another. And rebuilding lives requires healing as much as housing. Here, I would like to underline the relevance of social capital and informal networks, which can play a crucial role in easing IDPs' integration and supporting their recovery and mental health. And many times, these networks are the reason why IDPs go to certain neighborhoods or to certain cities. Local authorities play a central role in managing displacement. Often, and I make that point in the report, and I reiterated it yesterday, with very little support. They are on the front lines, yet often underfunded, underpowered, and underrepresented in national policy processes. Urban displacement requires a nuanced dual perspective approach, in which both the needs and the experiences of the IDPs are considered, as are the capacity and the dynamics of the urban systems that receive them. Within this framework, it is key to understand how municipal governance structures influence the success or failure of integration and reintegration processes. Fourth, the pressing need for data. Many IDPs in urban areas are not included in official statistics or censuses. If they are invisible in the data, they will be invisible in the policies. While writing the report, we found that urban profiling can be a critical evidence-based tool in the design, the implementation, and the monitoring of durable solutions in urban environments. Universities, research institutes have an essential role to play here, designing participatory, ethical, and inclusive methodologies that ensure displacement is counted and counted correctly. This brings me to my next point. Too often, policies frame local and integration as temporary or as optional. In reality, for millions of people, local integration has become the only option. Think, for example, of the Philippines or the United States. Last year, the US reported 11 million disaster-related movements because of hurricanes, floods, etc., nearly a quarter of the global total. Some people could return to their homes, but many had to integrate or resettle in other cities and towns simply because there was no other option. There was no home to return to anymore. And we are familiar with the cases and the families in places like Sudan or Gaza, where entire neighborhoods, entire towns have been totally destroyed. This brings us to the vital point of integrating displaced populations in urban planning, not as temporary residents, but as permanent stakeholders. While financial and political support usually favors return, integration and reintegration are equal rights-based pathways that must be fully reflected in national durable solutions plans. And let's not forget this, internally displaced persons are citizens and are residents of their own countries, and they may have had to leave because their house or their belongings, but they are right holders still. No conversation on displacement is complete without confronting intersectionality. So from people with disabilities to indigenous communities, policy must address layered realities and profound inequalities exacerbated by displacement. Academic inquiry can illuminate how intersecting identities affect access to rights and to services, and how displacement policies can or fail to respond appropriately. So as a special rapporteur, my reports normally include a series of recommendations to member states and to the international community. And for brevity, I would like to highlight a few aspects because you can read the report or the summary of the report. So first, states must show strong political leadership in responding to internal displacement crisis is vital, and can implement coordinated government action across development, housing, planning sectors with strong local governance structures. This requires early warning systems, adequate financing, updated data, and participatory platforms for IDPs. Second, it is vital to address the tangible and the intangible aspects of and integration, address psychosocial dimensions in all displacement responses, and recognize IDPs as agents of change. This is at the core of this report and of all my reports. IDPs as agents of change and as agents of their own solution. The goal is to ensure inclusion, not to have parallel systems. And to do that, we need to integrate IDPs within national and local urban development strategies and guarantee tenure security has proven to be key, and protection from forced eviction. Invest in data and evidence by equipping statistical offices, urban profiling, and monitoring social integration and well-being. And finally, it is key to transit from medium and long-term domestic funding and public investment strategies. So to To finish, I want to speak directly to the role of students and academics. I have already mentioned some possibilities, but you are the architects of future policies. You are designers of inclusive cities, analysts of data, advocates for justice. And for the Committee on Forced Migration at Columbia, and as the committee shows, displacement is not only a humanitarian issue or a development issue, it intersects with climate change, with urban planning, with sociology, with economics, with law, with peacebuilding, and beyond. Interdisciplinary approaches are a necessity. We need you in this path forward. And I'm really glad that we will have this dialogue among very different actors today, without forgetting that IDPs are not merely displaced people. Their displacement is a very important element of their history, of their story, but their lives go beyond that. They are workers, they are students, they are journalists, they are entrepreneurs, they are doctors, they are parents, they are musicians, they are wonderful people in most cases and bad people in others. No, they're just humans, and they're just citizens. They bring skills, they bring cultures, they bring new perspectives, they bring resilience, and their full inclusion benefits not only themselves, but strengthens the fabric in the entire community too. So I want to return to the words that mothers shared with me. We reached the city, but we are still searching for home. Because for many displaced people, home is not necessarily a physical place, but a condition of recognition, of safety, of rights realized. As members of the academic community, you have the tools to help shape a future where this search ends with inclusion and with justice. Your research, your teaching, and your engagement with communities and policymakers can be a part of the process. So in doing so, we don't only uphold the rights of the internally displaced, but we defend the promise of inclusive, equitable, and democratic societies for all. Thank you very much, Daniel.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Paula, for being here, for doing the work you're doing, and for sharing these insights. We look forward to hearing from the panelists in a moment, and then, of course, from the audience. What do you think, how this relates to what you do, and what kind of other partnerships that we might envision? Before we come to the panel discussion, which is, again, one of the highlights, at least as I'm concerned about today's event, we have a video by Tatiana Durnieva, who is an internally displaced person in Ukraine. And she kindly pre-recorded a short message that we're going to display now.
The head of the board of the... Hello, everyone. My name is Tatiana Durnieva, and I'm the head of the board of the Ukrainian NGO Group of Influence. 11 years ago, I was forced to leave my hometown, Donetsk, and became an IDP. When I was first displaced, moving to a new city meant starting from zero. New home, new people, new rules, etc. But what I also realized was not only that I had lost my home, but also my voice. As an internally displaced person, I couldn't vote for my local representatives. I couldn't sign a local petition or even participate in deciding how the public budget would be spent in the community where I actually lived with my kids. This lack of representation made me and thousands of others feel invisible. It slowed down our integration because when your voice cannot be heard, it's hard to feel that you belong. In Ukraine, we were equal citizens on paper, but not in practice. That's why, together with our colleagues at the Group of Influence and partners like IFES and Civil Network, ORA, and other organizations, we started a national advocacy campaign, Every Voice Matters. We met with members of parliament, organized advocacy campaign, trainings for IDPs across the country, held demonstrations, use every communication channel to change public opinion. And step by step, we turned silence into visibility. Thanks to these joint efforts, in 2019, the Ukrainian parliament adopted the new electoral code, which for the first time allowed IDPs to vote in their local communities. And in the 2020 local elections, IDPs across Ukraine finally exercises their right to vote where they actually live. But not only IDPs, about 5 million Ukrainians living away from their place of registration, like internal labor migrants, got the right to vote in their local communities. And this reform went beyond elections. Today, under the new legislation, IDPs are recognized as full members of their local communities. They now have access to all tools of local democracy. They can join public consultations, sign petitions, and take part in participatory budgeting. And even now, during wartime, when elections are suspended, IDPs can still influence decision-making at the local level. And for me, integration is not only about housing or jobs. It's about being seen and heard. When displaced people can participate, their ideas enrich communities and their involvement make peace building and recovery sustainable. The true integration happens when people are not just physically present in community, but also have a voice in shaping its well-being. So my story is a reminder that when IDPs' voices are heard, inclusion and social cohesion grow and society becomes stronger. Thank you for your attention.
I invite our speakers to join here. Okay. Test. Okay, can you hear me? So that was a very important reminder to always anchor our thoughts and our discussions in, as much as we can, the lived realities of the people directly affected by it. So I thank Paula and the team for this special rapporteur to actually highlight that we needed have Tatiana here and to start this off with her ideas about incorporation. So, as I said, my name is Daniel Naujoks, and I coordinate the global Comedy and Forced Migration here at Columbia. I also direct the UN Partnership Initiative, and I teach migration, refugee, and development studies. Actually, about 8 years ago, I was part of a UNDP team where we wrote a guidance note on municipalities and people on the move, which I'm not sure you saw that. It's like always the compartmentalization of you write reports and then nobody else sees them. But my own research is a lot on mobility, human mobility, including internal and international displacement mobility, and SDGs and development. We have a very distinguished group of panelists here with us, and I'm very excited to hear from them. First, I would like to give the floor to Sivanka Hanapala, who serves as director of the UN Refugee Agency's office here in New York. So Hanapala has held many different positions at UNHCR in Cambodia, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Myanmar, China, Iran, Afghanistan, Pakistan. And just before assuming his position here in New York, he was in Syria. So he has a lot of expertise both on classic refugee issues that UNHCR is best known for, but also in many of these contexts on IDPs. I would like to know from you, so UNHCR is officially the lead agency when it comes to protection of IDPs. What is your experience regarding the protection in urban areas? And how does it connect to the key findings and recommendations that we just heard from the special rapporteur? And one thing that Paula mentioned was her invitation for partnerships, especially you mentioned it with civil society and academia. But in your view, what partners, the coalition of actors are needed to effectively protect and deal with IDP issues in urban settings and beyond?
Thank you very much, Daniel, and thank you for organizing this event. Big thank you to Paula also for, in a sense, being the catalyst for this event, given that she is in New York also for the presentation of the third committee. Firstly, may I say, I mean, you know, you talked in your intro about this is a nice convergence of thinkers and doers. Within the UN, also, I'd like to think that there are nuances as well, and UNHCR obviously is a very field-based organization. We're very much on the practitioner side, but there too, I mean, interspersed with some of the field stints that you were describing, I also spent a number of some postings in both Geneva and New York. And one of my first postings in New York was you know, working for one of the predecessors, I would say the original Special Rapporteur, Francis Deng. And it was one of the first arrangements whereby I was seconded to his office, but based basically here in New York and acting as a liaison. So the whole issue of IDPs is certainly close to UNHCR's heart, but it's particularly close also to mine. And if I might, just also a reference to your statement, Paula, you talked about the suitcase that is carried by displaced persons. And you know, looking at the pain, but also you ended by saying what a displaced person can bring to a situation, the resources and so on. And there, what I was immediately reminded of when you were saying this is there was a poster in I think it was in the early 90s, the late 80s for UNHCR, which had that iconic picture of Einstein, you know, hair going everywhere, and saying a bundle of belongings is not the only thing a refugee brings with him or her. And, you know, one is left to assume that they can make a major contribution. So just to say that, and frankly, your report encapsulates that notion well, and how IDPs can also be agents of change, and they can be agents of economic change. Now, maybe just to say very quickly, fully in agreement with all the recommendations that Paula's report states. I think there is sometimes a false narrative that when you think of internal displacements and refugees, it's camps and camp settings. But you know, we have been arguing for a very long time that urban settings need attention. One has to work with a local government. One has to capacitate and work with local authorities. We have mayors' networks that we work with worldwide, frankly, on refugee issues, but we also need to move more towards internal displacement-related issues as well. As you said, you know, I've seen a number of field settings where there have been major issues of displacement, and the urban nature of it cannot be discounted. Very often, it's the urban setting that draws many people in for economic reasons as well. But it could also be safety and fleeing from violence. Ironically, and maybe just to turn things on their head a wee bit, when I was in Syria for the earthquake, we actually had a number of internally displaced persons leaving urban centers because of the damage caused and the fear of aftershocks and so on. So that takes place as well. Now, in the Syria context of today, by the way, and we'll have a conversation I know later, we also have situations where you have displaced persons who have nowhere else to go and who are occupying necessarily someone else's property. What do we do in those circumstances? And in a conversation with the Syrian ambassador to the UN just on Friday, he was expressing a huge interest in housing, land, and property issues, which now are really engulfing the government as a major issue. There are a number of examples I can use, Daniel, in terms of trying to translate some of these ideas into, you know, examples of what we're doing. But we fully agree that, you know, there are things like climate shocks, gang violence that can also create the kind of displacement within urban settings that that Paula talks about. Also, this issue of the intangibles, I couldn't agree more. I mean, identity matters. I mean, we see it with refugees, but internally displaced persons can just travel 2 hours away from their place of domicile and be in a completely new setting. And while there are fundamental legal, there's a fundamental legal differentiation between refugees and IDPs, the specific vulnerabilities of somebody who is displaced are very, very common. Now, just very quickly, and I don't want to, I know that there's a time issue, but on the issue of partnerships, Daniel, there, I think what is very important, I mean, and I don't want to preempt what my colleague from Habitat says, but, you know, we appreciate very much your reference to sustainable approaches in your report, Paula, because of course one has to look at, you know, what will last. We can't have a siloed humanitarian response only. Certainly life-saving when that is required, but as quickly as possible, we have to look at solutions from the start. And I think you make a reference to that as well in the report. So one big example, of course, is the UNHCR, UN Habitat collaboration, and really looking at the role of municipal authorities, how we can work more closely with them. I won't go into more details, and I don't want to steal the thunder of my colleague. But in Honduras also, we work very closely, just to give you an example, with community leaders, with I would say the host community as well as displaced communities on various projects that will not only address some of the intangibles that you talk about, but will also, in a sense, prevent those people who are from that area from being displaced. You know, there is also a right to stay, and I think that we shouldn't underestimate how important that is. In El Salvador as well, we have a network of youth-led urban centers, which are extremely important in the same vein. But then looking at you know, how we address municipalities, and we have a mayor's network that is global for refugees, but also persons who are internally displaced. And I would say something that's becoming more and more important is private sector engagement. Interestingly, and some of you might have been following the race for the successor of our High Commissioner. One is somebody who's coming in from the IKEA Foundation, a Swedish national, and that's a very exciting new development. And how, because everybody's saying as public sector support begins to decline, we have to look to the private sector, and that's a new element. But it's not just the private sector, it's also international finance institutions. And we have been working very closely also with those international finance institutions that don't necessarily give money. It's a non-transactional but strategic relationship that we have with the IMF, for example, with the World Bank, trying to direct their grants and their loans to host countries of refugees. But we can we're working with the IFC on how we can look at situations of displacement, internal as well as refugees, to see how de-risking can take place in order to attract the private sector into refugee hosting areas. And that is money that is not being sufficiently tapped and can easily come in, because that's a win-win-win, right? It's a win, obviously, for the displaced community, for the host community, for the business community, and for the country. So we want to pursue more and more some of these partnerships and really drill down. Case in point to a solutions group that has been formed between UNDP, UNHCR, and IOM, who are leading this process at the moment. Our sort of 3 deputies are right now in Nigeria pursuing private sector partnerships and how we can try to optimize on that. But I'll stop there because I know I'm probably exceeding my time.
Thank you so much, Simanka. This is enlightening. Let me ask you one more question, and leave it on, please, because then we pass it on. One more question. So many in the room here and those online know that the UN is in a dicey position currently. A lot of fewer funding, a lot of geopolitical challenges. From UNHCR's side, how are you addressing these challenges, and what concretely does it mean for your support for IDPs in urban settings? And that also then is connected a little bit to UN80 and to the mandate review and to like restructuring. But how exactly are you navigating in a few sound bites?
I would say sustainable approaches, sustainable responses. I think let me say this is nothing new. We have been pursuing, we used to call it, mind the gap and all that between development and humanitarian relief. And then there was talk about a continuum. It is very much along the same lines, but now we're trying to say, and my colleague from UNDP might shudder when I say this, but we actually talk about emergency development in UNHCR now, how we need to immediately from the get-go, when people are arriving as a displaced community, how can we try and make sure that the children are included in the education system, that they have access to employment, that they have access to healthcare. And of course, all these issues are much more difficult when you're talking about a refugee population, but surely with an IDP population where the government has that responsibility, we can try and push for it. It does mean also bringing in the development actors much more quickly. Now, I would say it's not a knee-jerk reaction to the fiscal crisis that we're going, but it makes it that much more relevant for us to pursue the partnerships that I just talked about earlier.
Thank you so much. Our next panelist is Fernando Travesi Sanz, who serves as Executive Director for the International Center for Transitional Justice. Before joining the ICTJ almost 10 years ago, he also was at UNDP, where he directed the Transitional Justice Basket Fund in Colombia, and he had several other positions with the UN Development Program, the ICRC, the International Committee of the Red Cross, and the NGO Movimiento por la Paz. Fernando, you've done a lot of research on IDPs. Most of IDPs flee from conflict and violence, often in fragile states. And the social fabric where they live is often negatively impacted by those displacements. In addition, one challenge for the integration is that they're often seen as newcomers, as people who can compete, who, from a social cohesion perspective, there are issues, especially when they're accused of being party to one side of the conflict. So in these complex scenarios, how can a justice-centered approach contribute to sustainable local integration of IDPs?
Thank you. I will thank you, Paula, and everybody, and I will not take more time on that, but thank you dearly for this conversation. I was about to say that as a transitional justice being a field that addresses the legacy of massive human rights violations, looking at the impact, but also the deep roots of conflict. Keep in mind that when I talk about IDPs, because I always think about people displaced because of conflict or authoritarian regimes or violations, as opposed to natural disasters that wouldn't apply to what I'm saying. But I think that as Paula has mentioned in this report, but also in the previous report on peacebuilding, transitional justice can contribute to the integration or reintegration in many different ways, and particularly in these intangible elements of trust, well-being, and mental health and psychosocial support. And we as an organization, we have considered for a long time displacement to be addressed through a justice lens. And then it's a focus that we have in our work on Syria, in Colombia, in South Sudan, in Lebanon, in Yemen, in many other countries that we try to highlight the needs and the justice claims of the displaced persons. I think in Syria, and we'll talk about it because it's an issue that it tackles at different elements. But regarding to these questions about the scarce resources, but also the stigmatization that sometimes displaced people suffered, I think there are two elements that are known on transitional justice that can really be meaningful in this conversation. One is reparations, and the other one is truth-seeking or truth and acknowledgement, because both of them can really have an impact on economic and social reintegration. We've seen in our own research, because I like also to say that ICTJ is a think tank that does the work. We think and we do at the same time. And actually in a cycle, what we think informs what we do, and what we do informs what we think. But our research has shown that reparations and restitution can facilitate economic reintegration, rebuilding sustainable livelihoods, restitution of property, supporting construction of homes and businesses, and providing educational assistance. And as Paula has pointed out, framing this support with a reparative lens as a reparation is really meaningful for a lot of people because it has an important psychological impact and it helps and contributes to restore the dignity of those affected by the displacement. I think in Colombia, in Guatemala, in Peru, we have a lot of reparations programs that have targeted explicitly the needs of displaced populations. And I think it's something that needs to continue being in many other countries. It's true that in many countries, like reparations happens in situations of poverty, in situations of conflict. The programs for reparation programs for IDPs should be not only on humanitarian assistance or immediate needs, but trying to overcome the social exclusion and reduce the risk of vulnerability, socioeconomic vulnerability of the IDPs. In urban areas, it touches upon issues that Paula has mentioned that goes from access to basic services, personal documentation, and addressing discrimination. What about the tensions? Tensions are always there, and it's very, very much the case in conflict cases when those who have left are looked from those who stayed with some mistrust, or those who are coming back are looked at like, what do we do with them? We don't have enough here for these people. What do we do with them? And that tension can be even exacerbated if we are in a conflict with ethnic dimension, religious dimension, and that can really be source of more violence. So in these cases, we have seen actually that truth-seeking, truth and acknowledgement can play a very important role. And we've seen that dialogues or other forms of acknowledgement can help to reduce those tensions. We've seen that in Colombia, in Guatemala, in Kenya, where the truth commissions, formal truth commissions, examined the role and the root causes of displacement in conflict. And then the suffering of the displaced people, their losses, and the stigma. And that helps to validate and to acknowledge their experience as victims and helps the community to understand that they are also suffering victimizations of different types. That can be done from a formal setting like a truth commission, but it can be done in a lot of informal settings like community dialogue, testimony, truth-telling through art, community art, and also programs of mental health and psychosocial support that are rooted in the community, in the capacity of the community. I think just 2 examples to finalize on this. I think in Syria, actually, we've been working since the beginning of this year, right in January after the fall of the Assad regime, to hold community dialogues between people who are returning refugees, but also displaced people and hosting communities to foster and enhance trust, to hear the stories of each other, and actually to identify common grievances and common needs that can really help to enhance and boost social cohesion. And then we have a report on that I think I just mentioned, Paula, and we can discuss about that. But also in the case of a stigma, and another example where IDPs might be considered part of the perpetrators, the Truth Commission in Peru also recognized that those displaced that were coming from the rural areas were usually associated with terrorists because they were coming from areas from Sendero Luminoso had power, and they would immediately identify that. We've seen that in Colombia as well. So the Truth Commissions have really explained to the society that they were actually victims of violations and they were leaving their territories, fleeing from insecurity and attacks. And that also helps to make a comprehensive view of the conflict and the victimization. So I think that can also inform many other decisions, and I stop here.
Thank you so much. Thank you much, Fernando. This is like really, really interesting to see the different aspects, how justice and transitional justice aspects are so important for dealing with the repercussions for IDPs in urban settings and elsewhere. Our next speaker is Laura Patterson, who is a team leader for strategic partnerships and communications at UNDP's Crisis Bureau. Obviously, she has many important positions before that, including she was the head of the SDG integration team the last time we had a chance to interact before. She worked on UN reform, and she had several field-based positions, including in Somalia. Laurel, a few years ago, I was actually involved in mapping UNDP's work on mobility, human mobility, and we did all the program documents, and everybody, including like longtime UNDP staff members and our ASG at the time, Magdi, was very surprised how much UNDP was actually working on IDP issues, right? Because it wasn't like something that UNDP put big on its banners, but actually there was a lot of work that UNDP did on IDPs, and UNDP is one of the lead agencies on local development. Right? If you look at local development, locally led development, UNDP has done a lot of work in many different parts of the world. So UNDP's work with local authorities on governance, on the rule of law, on a myriad of other issues on sustainable development relevant for IDPs come in very much in the discussion here. I would like to ask you, what has UNDP found to be the key for supporting local governments to integrate IDPs into cities? And can you share a few examples of the role that private-public partnerships, we heard already from several speakers, the role that the private sector may have in such endeavors?
Daniel, thank you. And it's nice to be here with all of you. I'm going to ask you some questions first, and then I will. And then I have homework, but it's for all of us, but it's also for you. But the first, just to say how much UNDP is working on this basis for the reason that Paula mentioned, it cannot be something for which a parallel system or some other structure or some other track or some other group of people is tackling. Displacement is lived locally. It's across everything that we do. And so one of the questions I wanted to put to you first is, if you are comfortable to raise your hand, who here is from New York? A New Yorker, as okay, a couple New Yorkers. Others from other parts of the US who are here, nice. Canadians, go Blue Jays. Okay, for those that, and okay, then are you from LA? You may want, oh, okay. Good that I caught that. And others from joining us internationally. All right, and so then another question related to this, how many of you are from cities yourself? Most of us, right? And how many, if you look back from your families over your parents or your grandparents, would you say you're among the first to be in cities? Raise your hands. Right. So again, for the reasons that was mentioned earlier, we see this move, and we'll continue to see this movement. So what I want to do is ask you to imagine yourself. It's October 2032. I picked the date in particular because if it's too close, it's hard to get out of what we're experiencing right now. If it's too far, we lose the reality of the moment. So if it was October 2032, ask yourself these questions. Where are you? Are you here in New York? Are you back in a different place? And be really, really specific in the morning that you wake up. What room are you in? Are you in an apartment? Are you in a house? Did you wake up with an alarm? Did you wake up with your dog? Did your kids wake you up? Right? What does that feel like? And the more and more that we can be specific in creating what that world might be, I would then invite you to walk outside. And this is where I want to connect with what Paula was mentioning earlier. Now imagine as you walk outside, and this could feel, very real for any of you, so it's not meant to be someone else's life, it's yours. Imagine that you're in your city, perhaps you've been there for a while, perhaps you just moved back or you've just moved into it, and it has grown by 200-300%. Imagine that. So imagine what that would look like in terms of the roads and the infrastructure system, right? How that would be overloaded, things would be broken, your local councils would be stretched. Imagine what that could look like for the electricity grid, more and more people trying to connect in, okay? Imagine what that would look like for services, for education, for your children, if you have them at that point in that scenario for you, whatever it might be, other services. This is the reality. Several have talked about Syria. This is exactly the reality in Syria. And the number of people that have returned is really, really low in comparison to those that remain displaced internally and across borders. And these are the exact questions. So the reason why I'm situating us together in that scenario, in that world, is that in every likelihood, you may not be the person on the move, you in the room here. You'll be in that scenario of receiving, right? And adjusting and contributing, hopefully, into a future that supports those that are on the move, which may not be you. And so answering the question then on some of the things that we've learned, the local decision-making is key. And so UNDP works in a very decentralized way. We work in 170 countries and territories around the world, and that local decision-making is key. It has to be integrated in budgets. This needs to be integrated in urban development planning. It needs to be integrated in plans and priorities for services, and also the way a lot of mayors engage local populations as their shadow cabinets and other ways, even below voting age and so on, to be able to engage in their community. So you have to have this local piece. One of the examples I'd give also from Middle East, not from Syria, but from Iraq, UNDP with several of the entities sitting here today too, supported 5 million people to return after the war within, but also across borders, and help rebuild their lives. And in places like Mosul, in places like Anbar, displacement was built into the housing plan, into the wider recovery plan, into the considerations for services. So it's not ours. Nobody's here. It's theirs. And it has to be brought in so we avoid the parallel systems. The second thing is that no municipality can do this on their own. Nobody can. So I think the points that are made on private, public, and so on, from Honduras to the DRC, in several other locations we're working, including Colombia, this ability to partner with private sector on training, vocational training, micro enterprises, building up small businesses. We know from our work in crisis response, it's the local private sector. We're seeing it across the world that can really drive that early phase of recovery, of a reestablishment of dignity, some sense of hope, some sense of agency, et cetera. So those partnerships are key. And it has to, again, be built into the leadership on the ground from the beginning. And the third point that I would share back is that the innovation and the flexibility is key. Things change. People migrate or move around for so many different reasons. And often when they're forced, which is, partly the discussion that we're having here, we're going to see more of that, forced by climate, forced by political context, forced by economic need. We need to be able to leverage all of the tools that we take advantage of in different ways every day, whether that's digital, whether that's futures and foresight, to get us working so that we can tackle that reality, even if we aren't literally facing it right now. But that flexibility and that use of innovation then is key. Then we can start to say, not only do we want to recover, but we don't want to do that as dependent on fossil fuel as we might have been. Not only do we want to recover, but we recognize that those displaced were the most marginalized geographically, ethnically among us. We tackle that head on and we bring it together. And there's so much that I think is possible when we look at these things together. The last point I just want to emphasize that Paul had made, it becomes a real question about data. And I ran a data heavy team before I started this job. The reality is that truly, if that data can't be brought into decision-making spaces, people are invisible. So it's not data for the sake of data. It has to be data that's locally owned. It has to be data that's shared transparently for decision-making. But the more and more that we don't have that, data is the foundation on which AI runs. And across all of our operations, across so many government operations, we're using AI increasingly to figure out how to prioritize, where to go first, what should we do next. If that AI runs on data, AI does not run on magic. And you're a group I don't need to tell that to. Sometimes at the UN, you do have to make that point. But for me, then it's really, really key that we take that seriously, or people disappear from the way that we prioritize. It becomes lost in an algorithm. And so that to me is a real opportunity, but also a challenge for where we sit right now. Maybe I do your homework at the end.
Thank you so much, Laura. This is, I also like your very interactive approach and like bringing the audience in, because I mean, that's a thing we all, many of us have migration histories through our families, ourselves, and many of us may have mobility in our future, right? Some of us planning that, many of us may not, and it will still happen. So I think that's a very powerful reminder. We have two more presentations. The next one is mixed, hybrid, and the last one will be online entirely. We will be staying with the UN, another family member in the UN family, UN Habitat, where we have two experts joining us. First, online, we have Philippe Decourt, who is the chief of UN Habitat's program development branch and also acting emergency director. Philippe has worked for UN Habitat for more than 20 years in many different capacities, including in Haiti, occupied Palestinian territories, Somalia, and Morocco. In his current position, he focuses on development and displacement, on urban planning, on land conflict, and the triple nexus, peace, development, humanitarian. He also used to be the chair of the Global Alliance for Urban Crises, so very strong urban focus, and he acted as a coordinator for UN Habitat's Global Disaster Management Program, which has very strong links to displacement issues. And he's joining us today from Nairobi. He's here. Okay, and he is joined by our expert sitting to my left, Andrew Rudd, who is based in New York here as an urban environmental officer and UN Habitat's urban planning and design branch in New York. He manages their portfolio on urban form, landscaping, planning, and public space. And what I find interesting, especially if people have different vitae that lead them to their work, she also worked as an architect in New York. And interestingly, he has published quite a bit on the New Urban Agenda, which was a big agenda for urban planning that UN Habitat spearheaded, and sustainable cities. So I don't know how you're going to split. So Philippe is starting, and then he's passed the floor to you. Okay, so Philippe, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Danielle. So first test is the microphone. I hope it works. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Now, I wanted to start exactly by thanking Paula for choosing the subjects of urban integration. I mean, the UN is a forum of national governments, and often the discussion is at that national level. It becomes about policymaking, it's abstract, and people become numbers, aggregated numbers. And so this is about people in specific places, people with specific backgrounds, specific vulnerabilities, looking for specific opportunities. And that personal, the tangible and intangible, I think is critical. And so having brought this discussion to the UN, I think has been very important. It echoes a lot of the messages and the work we've been doing over the years. Now, I think I wanted to start with, in the report, there is this notion that local governments usually view internally displaced people as temporary residents. Our experience is slightly more nuanced. We have seen, yes, specifically us, the international system, looks at IDPs as a caseload, as a temporary humanitarian problem that needs to be addressed here and now. Our experience working with mayors, we've done it for over 20 years, and local governments, is that for them, it's a challenge, but it's a development challenge in terms of access to basic services. And our point has been with mayors successfully also increasingly that it's also a development opportunity. If we invest correctly, make it part of urban development, that's the way we use this opportunity to address specific problem to create much more sustainable and inclusive pathways for a city. For a mayor, exactly, when we engage mayors, yes, they fully understand the need that people need assistance, but for them, exactly, their day-to-day focus is how to address this influx of people. It means accelerated growth. If they don't deal with it, it's more informality. They want to have a planned city. They're already struggling with services for their host communities, for their communities that are there from before. And for them, exactly, the question is as much about how to help people just arriving, but as also helping, of course, their communities that are there and for whom they've been struggling to provide the services. And of course, yes, they're also concerned with social issues. This tension between newcomers and host communities is a reality. Often unpacking that and creating an environment that they can overcome it, because no city will develop exactly if social tensions are the norm. So social cohesion, social inclusion is very much on their mind, and there exactly are the true champions to make that happen. So local governments, and that's the report recognizes very strongly, is exactly where we can make that difference. Now, the question when it comes to this idea of parallel services, and again, I would argue it has been very much imposed by the way the international system has organized itself and has responded over the years. And speaking to the point of the colleague of UNHCR, we have made a lot of progress in the last couple of years. I was an academic until early 2000s, teaching urban planning. I was suddenly found myself in Somalia, working for UN Habitat. I ended up in a port city in the Northeast. 25% of the population were IDPs. And we were confronted with the reality that all the IDPs were kind of in the fringes of the city in very dense camps, makeshift structures, no sanitation, no access to water, being burned down every year by accident, but sometimes also on purpose by the landlords. And the question of the UN, the obsession of the UN was, how many people need what now? Let's give it to them. While nobody was trying to understand the question, why were people there in the specific places in those conditions? And when we started talking to the mayor and local government people, and just asking around, the issue was very simple. These were valuable pieces of urban real estate controlled by landlords that didn't necessarily fully own them, but having IDPs on the land did two things for them. It allowed them to keep control of the land until they were ready to develop it, and allowed them to have a rental income, because of course they were charging IDPs for being on the land. And maybe thirdly, forgot to say, didn't allow any permanent structures or investments in sanitation because they wanted to have the land ready to develop the next day. The moment we were able to say, look, this is an issue exactly of people are paying rent, they have certain rights. This is creating problems for the environment, for the host community in terms of sanitation, the fires not to begin with. So this is also an issue of the host community. We were able to change the equation. It became an issue exactly of housing, land, and property. We created rental agreements, not also with the local governments, IDP communities, and the landlords, and started shifting. And when we responded to a fire, we were bringing in fire breaks, which are basically for us a way to connect those camps to the neighborhoods. And we made a point, if we would invest in services, be it a health clinic, anything that is being invested in needs to be accessible also for the host community. The second problem was in that situation that the answer was, again, the UN, where the answer was, let's move people out, give us land, and we will provide for them. We will help these people with everything they need, education, housing, and so forth. And of course, you ask government to give land, so 25% of the population, 25,000 people. Land was being given in the middle of nowhere, in the desert, 10 kilometers out of town. Of course, land of no value. And the UN was busy planning. I was an urban planner, and we kind of raised our little finger and saying, this is not going to work. These are people working in the port. These are people working in the markets. They will have to come back. They cannot afford to be out there. It will not be sustainable. And we quickly, discussing with the mayor, we had an argument around the economic contribution exactly to the success of the town, the need to be integrated socially, economically, and spatially. And we said, look, let us help you plan your town better. It's about productivity, access to the ports. Let's open up the land in this direction, we're much more sustainable. And as we do that, as we plan the urban growth, let's integrate this issue of displacement into the urban growth strategy of the town. And let's use the investments that were there to extend water with UNICEF, humanitarian funding, to trace a road, to help open up the land. The mayor exactly very quickly, and I'll make the long story very short, organized a town hall with basically, of course, with the elite in town, with everyone who wants to listen, live on TV. We're active in the mosques to make an argument exactly of this win-win situation, investing in the town's growth and the value of exactly integrating the displacement question into that strategy. And it worked, because Somalis, of course, are very good business people, and the added value on land and the capture of that added value to some extent for public goods, including integration of IDPs, worked. And so many years later, if you look at the satellite images, the town has changed quite dramatically. Now, we've captured a lot of those lessons learned in the last couple of years building on the Secretary General's Action Agenda on Internal Displacement, into a programmatic framework. I put it in the chat. But basically, the question was also, we have to move away from ad hoc solutions to a programmatic approach. Like, what are the elements that need to be there to have solutions that are scalable, sustainable, and transformative? With transformative, we meant not more informality, but actually exactly planned growth and a more sustainable pathway. And local governments are the champions for this. They fully understand how this works. We ended up crystallizing 3 critical mindset shifts in 5 core principles. And the mindset shifts are basically elements that we should know better. We have seen good examples, but somehow we still have a collective amnesia, and we always forget about it. The way we organize, the way we program, the way the financing is working. And they're very simple, and they're also reflected in the report. 1, this is not just about solutions for IDPs. This is about pathways to inclusive urban development. 2, is exactly moving away from this humanitarian focus to the development challenge and opportunity. And 3, of course, not looking at IDPs as a caseload, but actually as urban citizens within a community that, of course, with all the rights that come with that. The principles are very simple also, really work with the existing systems, recognize what is there, the urban profiling that Paula referred to, really push, and this is Laurel's point, this issue of agency and the voice of the displacement affected communities, make it part of decision-making. 3, and this is our point, there's a difference for us between a local approach and an urban approach. Andrew can speak to this very well. But for us, of course, it's about very specific places. And it works differently at different levels. It's a systems approach that is needed. Everything is connected. Understanding issues of control over land are very important. Issues of power dynamics. And so it's important to have that focus on location and space. 4th point for us is any investment that is being made, be it by a humanitarian or a community, there needs to be a no regrets approach, do no harm. So whatever we do today needs to be one step closer, one step on the direction of a more sustainable pathway. And then, of course, the last point, this local government ownership is critical when it comes to data, when it comes to anything that is happening. And this is also where this message to the member states is also key in the current environment of challenged multilateralism. Local governments are often the voice and the champions of solutions that actually make a difference. So let me pass it on to Andrew to kind of break down a bit more what it takes to make this part of urban development strategies and avoiding parallel systems.
Thanks, Philippe, and thank you, Daniel. A lot of poignant lessons, many of which and much more have been incorporated into Paola's report. Thank you very much. I had the pleasure of being in the room yesterday for that unveiling. So I suppose in these few minutes, I'm between you and questions and lunch. I'm going to pose the question of why aren't we seeing more of the principles we're recommending? What else do we need to be doing? So I've got 3 answers to that, three shifts essentially. One is about cities. Many up here in the report have said cities are still the best advantage for IDPs, but those advantages are not automatic. They require balancing and support. Cities offer proximity, anonymity, diversity, and safety, helping IDPs avoid persecution, access jobs and education, etc. But cities need to make an extra effort to avoid that IDPs are in informal settlements. This is the default, right? These are places where hazards are highest, access is worst, and to avoid that they are getting the most insecure jobs. Cities need to be making sure that IDPs are counted within their populations. This seems hugely obvious. It is not happening in a lot of places, and it has profound impacts on the budgeted investment for specific neighborhoods. Cities also need to balance the assistance they offer. Paola mentioned earlier, when IDPs are integrated into host communities, there sometimes is the high risk of resentment, that there is favoritism, that there are special offers of assistance not available to long-standing low-income locals. This needs particular care. And cities need to balance decision-making with higher levels of government. And this means a commitment from national governments to make sure cities are mandated and resourced, and that they're offering things that cities can't. Access to documentation, work authorizations, and other things like this have to complement what it is that cities are offering and match with good employment from private sector. That's one shift. Secondly, urban planning and design, we've talked a lot about this already on the stage. They're still critical, but they need to extend, in our opinion, extra effort towards timing and location. Philippe mentioned that cities really need to plan for permanence. Often IDPs go through what we call the typical phases of acuteness, consolidation, and protraction. We need to plan for that end stage. Certainly, we're avoiding slums. Camps are an improvement on slums, but they're not normally designed for permanent habitation. They're often single-family freestanding houses with cheap, energy inefficient materials. They don't integrate well. Segregation has very high costs for everyone, but particularly for IDPs. So we need to plan for that long term. That's the timing piece. The location piece I mentioned earlier. Planning needs to ensure that IDPs are not accommodated on the most hazardous land. Often it's the cheapest land, can be flood prone, far from the city core. Not much use if there's no access to jobs and services, particularly if there's in public transit, cars are required. Find locations that are close to the core where there is real access to jobs and services. Thirdly, the psychosocial component. We're really, really pleased to see this highlighted in your report, Paula. It's not just about physical survival. And this is going to require a lot more investment to mental health and other aspects, which we barely provide to our own populations, much, much less to IDPs. And this isn't just about doing the right thing, but it's about avoiding intergenerational trauma that's passed from generation to generation that will, in all likelihood, put in place a kind of downward spiral for a lot of IDPs and their descendants. So we're advocating for that. Above all this, I would say the meta issue, to my mind, is prevention. Investing in prevention. It's something that the UN, I used to say has gotten good at. Now I'm tempted to say had, sadly, gotten good at in terms of preventing war, right? Post-World War II, this was a thing. Not as good in the development sphere. Well, I'll stop it at that and say prevention is the only way we're going to avoid the kind of infrastructural lock-in that keeps vulnerable populations, especially IDPs, out of access and to avoid this kind of intergenerational trauma. With that, I pass back to you, Daniel. Thanks.
Thank you. And thanks, Philippe, for both really putting the emphasis on avoiding of parallel structures. One of the key things that Paula mentioned in her presentation too, the idea that Andrew just mentioned about permanency and temporality, like the idea that we often think about displacement as very short term. And again, some IDPs actually are very short, for the hurricane coming, something just short term, but a lot of IDP situations, especially where it's conflict and other related, often are decades, sometimes generations. So that you have to think in many cases about long-term planning. And if you think about this humanitarian approach of just stabilizing lives, you may miss out on a lot of the things that actually are needed for those populations. Actually, but one thing I have to correct Andrew on, not in the substance, but in terms of our programming, because we're not at the Q&A yet. We have one very important additional speaker. We have Dr. Caitlin Sturridge, who, same as Philippe, is joining us from Nairobi, but not from UN Habitat, but from ODI Global, where she is a senior research fellow in the Humanitarian Policy Group, where she specializes on displacement issues. And actually, Dr. Sturridge is leading a 3-year research project on the lives and livelihoods of urban IDPs. So she is really an expert on many of the questions we're discussing today. Caitlin, thank you so much for being here. I know it's like late-ish in Nairobi. In her report, Paula suggests that reintegration should be recognized on par with the right to return. Would you agree with that position? And what are the lessons that you can draw on from the research on internal displacements? Then specifically also echoing what Lauren from UNDP said, what we heard from UNHCR and UN Habitat, which is about the sustainable approach to reintegration. What are the challenge opportunities you see on the horizon in as little time as you can bring a very important substantive presentation to us?
Thanks, Daniel. I hope you can all hear me. Can you hear me loud and clear?
Could you speak up a little louder?
Yep, I can speak up. Is that any better?
Yes.
Okay. Thanks so much for the opportunity to speak to you today. And Paula, thanks so much for your report. I really enjoyed rereading it in preparation for this event. And I just kind of to reiterate what some of the other speakers have said, I think you've really touched on some really important points that other people are just either not touching on or kind of not really focused on at all. So it's great to have you spotlighting those topics for us. One of the main points that you made in your paper was around the importance of reintegration vis-a-vis returns as well. And we know that in displacement, there is often a significant pressure on IDPs to return to where they came from. And this goes back to what some of the other speakers were talking about, of IDPs being seen as a kind of temporary caseload. I would wholeheartedly agree with your emphasis in the paper on reintegration, especially in the kinds of places where we've been doing a lot of our research recently. So I'm thinking of places like Somalia, Ethiopia, Iraq, Mozambique, Afghanistan, places where we know IDPs are unlikely to return, at least in the short term. We know that in those contexts, the drivers of displacement are ongoing: recurring droughts, unresolved conflicts, long-term climate change. And we also know that in those contexts, displacement has already persisted for years, if not decades. Children are born into displacement, and many have already established themselves in the city, and they're not really looking to return anytime soon. So in these kinds of scenarios, IDPs should be allowed to reintegrate into cities without being pressured to return. But I guess I want to add one more nuance to that perspective, and this is something that's come out of a paper that we're writing at the moment, focused on Baidoa in Somalia. And this isn't to detract from the importance of reintegration in cities, but I guess it's to try and deepen an understanding of what the dynamics and the mechanisms of reintegration can look like. And I want to, in order to do that, I want to focus on this idea of rural-urban linkages. So we've talked a lot about the urban, and I want to try and kind of, I guess, blur some of the distinctions between the urban spaces and the rural settings that we've been looking at so far. So in the paper that we're writing, we're spotlighting on this idea of rural-urban linkages. So I'll just start off by quickly saying what I mean by that so that it's clear for everybody. So in the context of Baidoa, we're seeing rural-urban linkages as manifesting in certain ways. So those are pendular or circular movements, IDPs moving back and forth between the city of Baidoa and then the kind of rural places that they originated from before they were displaced. There's a movement angle to that, but there's also something around social connections, and these social connections being sustained across households or relatives split across rural and urban settings. And there's also this element of a reciprocal sharing of goods, of information, of ideas, of food, of money, and definitely the proliferation of mobile phones and mobile money platforms has made this a possibility for people to kind of share back and forth their resources. So that's what we're thinking about when we're talking about rural-urban linkages. What does this tell us? It tells us some interesting things around reintegration or integration into cities. It tells us that just because IDPs move from a rural to an urban setting, this doesn't mean that mobility is one directional. And it also tells us that just because IDPs may prefer to stay and integrate in the city, that doesn't mean they've turned their backs on their rural way of life or their rural livelihoods that they were involved in prior to displacement. It's this blurring of the lines between the rural and the urban, which I think is really important in understanding processes of reintegration. IDPs can aspire to both, and they can build their lives and their livelihoods simultaneously across these rural and urban settings. In Somalia, but also in other settings, we are seeing these rural-urban livelihoods as being very important. That's not to say that everybody is doing them, but actually a lot more people than we would have thought are involved in these lives and livelihoods spanning the rural and the urban. But we see that they're often unseen by aid actors. They don't really conform to the kind of mainstream approaches to the delivery and the design of aid and assistance. These rural-urban livelihoods are also important because they enable people to navigate risk. It's a way of sharing money, sharing resources and food during times of crisis or emergency. It's an important safety net that people are using. And it allows people to diversify and sustain their livelihoods in ways that they wouldn't if they were just in the city. And it also, I think, raises some interesting questions around the prospects of return. We know that people who sustain some kind of relationship with the place where they left are more likely to return one day. So it leaves that door open. So I guess just to sum up, why have I talked about rural-urban livelihoods? I guess I find them interesting on many different angles, but with regards to this particular event, they are a really important reminder that reintegration and return don't exist as binaries, and that IDPs can in fact have one foot in the city and another foot in their rural place of origin, and that actually they should have a right to both, often simultaneously. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. This was very insightful, and I think the research you're doing in Eastern Africa is so important. I actually really look forward to reading more about it and to getting more of the findings of your research. So we are officially at the end of our time, but I would like to open the floor just for a moment, maybe 2 or 3 short questions only from people in the room here. So if you're joining us online, sorry, in enough time, I would like to open it just a few questions. And we have a lightning round of just 25 seconds or so for each person to give a very short final statement. Yes, actually, so Miriam. And could you please introduce yourself very briefly and then keep it as short as possible, the comment or question you may have.
Thank you very much. Nina Lahoud. I spent my career with the UN in field settings, a large chunk of it in context of peacekeeping missions, and on the board of ICTJ. The amazing presentations. But one of the questions that lingered after hearing all of them is that I didn't hear much about 2 issues, and I wondered how much of a concern they were. One, the situation I found in so many places, including as a legal advisor in Lebanon, of IDPs or returnees claiming property belonged to them. And at the same time, the dual problem of an unstable or inexisting government. So it's not just a matter of saying you need to go to the government and see blah, blah, and compounding that they've lost deeds, ownership materials. So that's one, because you talk about, you know, places and how to structure them and going to the mayor and all, but sometimes all of those are nebulous in that setting. Secondly, and it's particularly today, but I found in a lot of places, the attitudinal backlash, you know, the resentment. I think some societies are receiving their own nationals back and maybe more receptive, but this backlash issue that, you know, we can't barely afford to live, and why should we spend our government money on these others? Thank you.
Pretty in the back.
Hi, thank you for the presentations. I'm Vritti. I'm a student at Columbia University, SIPA. but I also have experience of working in internal migration in India. And I'm coming from a setting where displacement was largely economic and due to natural disasters. And I've always been curious. I know we talk about discriminating bureaucracies and municipalities, but sort of market is also very discriminatory to migrants, to internal migrants, as I've seen in my working setting. So if you have some sort of thoughts on that, I would love to hear. Thank you.
Okay, one last if someone wants, otherwise, okay, maybe back there.
Hi, my name is Emily. I'm a master's student at Teachers College in International and Comparative Education. And I think one thing that I struggle with is how do you, with internally displaced persons and also refugees, create a feeling of trust and belonging within governments that have typically excluded them, or within education, largely push propaganda to kind of skew? And what would kind of be like the biggest first steps to build like that unity, that belonging? What spaces would be the best for them to have trust in their systems again?
Thank you, Emily. So now I think a lightning round. We're really ideally under a minute. Let me start like geographically, right from the far right, not politically, but well, the dice, and then make our way through.
I was a bit uncomfortable with the far right comment, so it can be misunderstood now.
From the audience, far left.
Yeah. No, just two concrete questions to your both questions on the property restitution, land and housing property restitutions, and also social trust. Those are transitional justice processes in conflict context that they have a lot of layers, but the issue of property occupation, restitution, confiscation, fraudulent operations, classes with a lot of legal problems from the lack of documentation, lack of legal certainty. It's a process that we've seen in Bosnia, we've seen it in Syria, and it's a trigger of violence and abuses that needs to be addressed by a government that, by doing that, restores trust and confidence in the population, in hosting communities, but also in the returnees. And then that trust, it's also meant to be restored through multiple processes: meaningful participation, consultation, listening, immediate delivery of basic needs, and participatory programs for addressing long-term needs. Just one thing, putting it in there and responding to some question about data and touching on the restoring the trust. Data is essential. We all know that. We need it for everything. I just wanted to put the quotient and the caveat that data collection is also political. And sometimes the data collection can undermine the legitimate objectives we are talking about. So data needs to be collected with a human rights-based approach and with participatory approach. Otherwise, will be data-informed processes, but completely in the opposite direction that we want to achieve. So that's it.
So right of center here. I'll be very lightning quick. Daniel, just to very quickly respond to some of the questions raised, because I think there was a nice interlinkage between a number of the questions as well. On claims, property claims, and so on, just to let you know, Nina, that we work in a number of countries. I mean, we've seen it with the establishment of a property commission in Bosnia, for example, but in Syria, as a more recent example, we work with government, and before the December 8th, it was one government, now it's a new government, but we continue the projects of working in terms of rehabilitating cadastral offices, in terms of rehabilitating civil registries, which are ever so important in terms of documentation, in terms of land restitution, and so on. The question, and I was discussing this with Paula just a few days ago, is sometimes you have legitimate authorities and then some authorities that are not deemed legitimate who are awarding land, and what does one do if that perceived to be a legitimate authority already gave land to person X, Y, or Z, who by no means is affluent or influential, but received that land and depends on it for their livelihoods. On mitigating, I mean, the tensions between host communities and displaced communities, that's something we've been doing certainly with refugees, but also with IDPs. And I think a number of the projects that I highlighted earlier are also with that intention in mind. How do we try and create a bond between the host community and the displaced community. And that can be done in a number of different ways, but really projects that improve the quality of life in the community as a whole, I think, is what we're looking at. How can the displaced community also contribute, whether that's through employment or other means, I think is important. And that also addresses some of the intangibles as well. One last point I wanted to also quickly make is the magnitude of the crisis of urban displacement. I mean, you talk in the report, Paula, about over 50 million. Just to say, I mean, in the context of Syrian returns, and this is, of course, returning refugees, the colleague was saying, you know, it's happening slowly, but in fact, it's skyrocketed. In 2023, we had 38,000 people returning, those who could return despite difficult situation in Syria. Last year, we had 400,000. That was mostly because of the deteriorating situation in the country of asylum, like Lebanon. But from the 8th of December, it has skyrocketed, and we passed the 1 million mark in September during high-level week of the General Assembly. And we are probably projecting another 1 million in 2026. So how do we deal with that? And I think certainly looking at some of the issues that we've discussed and that Paula addresses in her report, data and protection. I mean, I think we certainly acknowledge the centrality of protection in everything we do. That's something that we can work on. The proximity that we have to populations in some of the work we have, I think, is extremely relevant in understanding the challenges that are faced by communities, but also because of, I mean, we work with the local authorities. We have to work with the mayors, and we have to include them in everything we do. So I think that and the usage of a lot of the protection tools that, including your report, by the way, is something is really paving the way forward. Saying thank you.
Since we're coming to the end and you're at the far left, I'll add a radical response to what was raised on this question of how to engage with governments, you know, that may have intentionally excluded certain populations in the past, over time, historically, and so on. And so my response to that would be, we have to get better at organizing ourselves so that we can insist. Not everyone can be convinced through the kinds of fora that we're talking about here, good data, persuasiveness, they can't. There have to be other mechanisms, and you have to insist. And so that's something where I think the other partners coming to, what is the influence? What is the ability to insist and to demand on behalf of populations that they're included? This work that we do here isn't for sunny days. It's not because people will agree with us. Most of the time they won't. So the resilience, even for you and for us, to say, I don't give up. I find another way. I insist. If it's not me at the front of the table, I put somebody else there that is going to get the message across. We insist. And I think for where we are at the UN right now, we haven't fully, but we slightly touched on this. We need to be able to defend that we are stronger together. The UN is under attack. You're seeing the attacks here. We're watching this. So our usual approach, looking for the connectors, finding the right argument, using the data, fine, but not good enough. And so I really look through this fall. We know next year we're going to see 80 million people that fall out of the humanitarian support. Life-saving will be prioritized. 80 million outside of this. Imagine what that looks like for all of the conversations that we're having. So for me, we demand, we insist, we don't give up, we fight back in different ways. But I want to say that because I think we're going to come up with more and more of those experiences where people say, it's a backlash. I don't want that group. I don't want these, this is whatever. And we have to be ready to tackle that head on. And that can be a challenge for us. That's the one that I think we have to get right.
Thank you. Philippe?
I'll make an old point when it comes to the trust of government is exactly, it's continue to pushing for that inclusive governance models. That is not just about government and other powerful stakeholders, but actually giving voice to communities. The example of the Ukrainian IDP said, look, I'm here now, I need to be able to discuss budgeting. What goes where, what is being invested where. So this, it has to go down to that level. And so this continuous push on inclusive governance is for us the way to build the trust. We have the experience of Somalia also that include exactly really working with the imams and the mosques to be able to translate human rights into local values and say, look, this is not acceptable. This abuse by landlords is just not acceptable. and changing the mindsets around those things, because if it's just limited to the elite, things are not going to change.
Thank you. Caitlin?
Yeah, thank you. I'll respond to the question that hasn't been responded to, which is around building a sense of trust and belonging. I think from what we see across the board in our research, this the role of social networks is really key. And Paula, you speak about that a lot under the kind of umbrella term, I guess, of the intangibles. And I think there's the kind of question of social cohesion, social networks, but also dignity and well-being. And I think those are really critical for a sense of belonging. And Tatiana in the video at the beginning talked about how important it is to feel to be seen and heard. And I think that kind of speaks to some of that intangible side of things. What worries me a little bit at the moment, and maybe building on the kind of the backlash, is that as funding becomes increasingly constricted, there is a tendency to scale back to this kind of back to basics, to the life-saving, to the emergency. That puts in peril a lot of what you were talking about, Paula, in your report around investing in these longer-term solutions. It also puts in peril questions around some of these intangibles, which you rightly highlight. They have been deprioritized for a long time, and I can only imagine that in a context of funding cuts and a kind of back to basics, those social networks, cohesion, well-being are going to be deprioritized even further. So I think kind of really being kind of strong about that, and kind of making sure that we continue to underline that just because something isn't physical or something you can hold on to, that doesn't make it any less sustainable or value for money or important. And I think particularly when it comes to this question of longer term protracted displacement and this need to have a sense of belonging, those are what really count a lot at the end of the day. Thanks.
Thank you so much. I will take 25 seconds, and I promise I will be, just not to summarize, my intellectual capacities are not sufficient to summarize all the amazing points that have been made, but just to highlight a few things. One, so we heard that there are 80 million IDPs in the world, 50 million of which are in urban areas. So this is really, really a sizable problem, though, of course, in the scheme of our 7 billion world population, it's also one that we actually should be able to manage if we put resources to it. We heard that we need better planned and more adjusted approaches that also use IDPs as agents of change. Again, thinking about how to work with communities, displaced communities, not only for displaced communities. We need to focus on planning processes and really bring sustainable development in. One of the key things that we know there's sustainable human rights-based approaches to development, but the idea of bringing together a rights-based approach and the idea that livelihoods, housing, social services, all these different ideas that are connected to the SDGs and development are really key for making people's lives better, both for the communities that host them as well as for the IDPs themselves. And lastly, the entire question of social cohesion, the idea how we integration socially, culturally, legally, from a housing and residential perspective, all these different aspects of integration and social cohesion are so important, and we need to put them at the center of these debates. Before we conclude, I would like to thank my program assistant, Miriam Youssef, who ran the entire thing. And I thank our speakers. I thank you, the audience, both in the room and online, for joining us. It was a great discussion. It is not a discussion we're ending here. I think this is, again, a starting point for more discussions on how development and IDPs can be linked in the future. And this has not been the last time we at Columbia host something on this. Thanks for joining, and I look forward to seeing you somewhere else soon.